I've known Juan Enriquez for a long time, and I am proud to call him a friend. Part of what makes him so unusual and brilliant is his ability to cross boundaries and connect dots. Now, as you may already know, he has an extraordinary impact in a wide range of fields. His work decoding the DNA with Kring-Vettner is itself a remarkable story. But his work isn't purely scientific. In fact, he often tells stories and engages in issues that are deeply personal. Earlier this year, speaking from the TED stage in New York, he spoke about his Mexican heritage and shared a story about immigration and the crisis on the US-Mexico border, saying, and I quote, "This isn't about kids and borders. It's about us. This is about who we are as people, as a nation, and as individuals." Now, way back in 2009, he asked the question, will our kids be a different species? It wasn't meant to be a rhetorical question. Even back then, he asked if we could be mid-upgrade. His latest book, Right Wrong: How Technology Transforms Our Ethics, poses some questions that are both theoretical and shockingly practical. Tech is powerful. Tech is dangerous. Tech provides us with new opportunities to shape our bodies, our society, and the world. But if we don't consider its impact and outcomes, we're likely to find ourselves victims of ethical impact of new technology that is possible, but perhaps not advisable. So join me in welcoming Juan Enriquez and get ready for a journey into the future that you won't soon forget. Juan, take it away.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for coming. Let's get right into it. So I think what I'd like to do here in talking about right wrong is to talk to you about this whole notion that we know right and we know wrong. And we're so inbred into that. And in a sense, what's happened to us is something similar to what happened to warfare when the machine gun appeared. So before the machine gun, you had warfare in various ways. You had duels, you had fields, you had different battlegrounds, etc. And what the machine gun did is it took warfare and it stuck it into trenches. And so during World War I, what ended up happening is you were either in the French-British trench or you were in the German trench. And you didn't move. And you shot at the enemy, and you shot at the enemy across no man's land. And anybody who tried to cross into no man's land was killed. So there was no middle ground, no place to meet to fight. It was just trench to trench. And the really strange thing is, if you moved towards the enemy, you died. And if you moved out of your trench in the opposite direction, you died. Because your own group would shoot you because you'd become a deserter. So you literally were stuck in the trench. And in a very strange way, what's happened to us today, politically, socially, as groups, is we've ended up in trenches. And so you can't quite pick and choose whether you agree with this or you agree with that. You're either in the trench on the right or you're in the trench on the left. You're either in the liberal trench or you're in the conservative trench. And there's less and less middle ground where you can pick and choose stuff, because if you begin picking and choosing stuff, then they will shoot at you with tweets, with Facebook posts, with various media. And it's not just that they're shooting at the enemy, they're shooting often at their own. So anybody who deviates from the norm, enters a no man's land or becomes a deserter and gets shot at either way. The problem with the system is, if you take the position that you are 100% right, you may be on the side of the angels, you may be 90% more right than the other folks, but if you take the position that you're 100% right and everybody else is completely wrong, then there's no discussion, there's no tolerance, there's no evolution, there's no learning, and there's certainly no humor in this, right? We've lost our capacity for humor, and any joke can be the subject of HR accusations, of exile from your tribe. These are no joking matters. And that leads to this very weird situation where sometimes you fear those who are on your side as much as you fear those who are on the other side. because if you have a discussion on campus, or if you have a discussion at the office, or if you have a discussion with friends or whatever, or you post a wrong tweet, or you wore the wrong costume 10 years ago, or you sat next to the wrong person 10 years ago and were photographed, you can be canceled by your own tribe. And often it's your own tribe that is incredibly brutal at burning you at the stake, because they deem you a heretic. They deem you insufficiently on the side of right. And that's a very dangerous situation, because as you're looking at this stuff, it forces you to take a side. And when there's no middle ground, you either fly a Black Lives Matter sign on your yard, or you put a "We support the police" sign on your yard. And you're forced to choose a side. And the really strange thing is, these two things become incompatible. So it's not that you're seeing Black Lives Matter on the lawn alongside "We support the police." And yet the weird thing is, when you ask people, 2/3 of the population is in favor of Black Lives Matter, and 2/3 of the population is in favor of the police. So there's a great big overlap in this middle ground, and people are being forced to the extremes. I absolutely support Black Lives Matter, but having grown up in Mexico, I understand what a dysfunctional police is. I understand what happens to a country when the police becomes corrupt, or when the police is non-existent, and you don't want to live in that. So one thing that's, you see these occasional attempts to occupy a middle ground. This ad, if you haven't seen it, you should go look at it. It's an ad by the two candidates to become governor of Utah. And they start out and they say, "I want to be governor. I want to be governor. I think I'm right. I think I'm right. But regardless of who wins, we're going to support the other person. We're going to support Utah, and we stand for a United States of America." Well, this thing got 2.8 million views in less than 24 hours. So there's this great big yawning middle ground of civility and listening to one another that we seem to be losing more and more every day. And part of the reason why you should think about right and wrong is, let's assume for a second that some of you listening are 100% right. You are the rightest people on the planet in terms of being just, in terms of being ethical, in terms of understanding others' pain, everything that it takes to be right. Even if you're Mother Teresa, the question you've got to stick in the back of your mind is, if you are 100% right today, will you be 100% right tomorrow? And the reason you should ask that question is, you should look at the evidence, and the evidence is that our notions of what's right and wrong do change over time. So it used to be normal and natural to practice human sacrifice. And it was legal and expected and celebrated. And the justification for murdering hundreds of thousands of people in very painful ways was that if you don't do this, then the sun won't rise, or the rains won't come, or the civilization will end. So there was a quote unquote legal justification, societal justification for something that in retrospect we understand is absolutely completely barbaric. All right, that was a long time ago. That was the Aztecs and a whole bunch of other folks. But more recently, it used to be common, normal, and natural to execute people in public squares. In fact, it was the Saturday evening entertainment, and it was part of the justice system, and people would sell trinkets, and people would sell postcards, and people would bring the kids, and it would be a great big giant spectacle and celebration. And again, we look at this and we say, what in the hell were these people thinking? This is so fundamentally barbaric. So maybe that just occurred in the past, and maybe it'll never occur to us, but just stick in the back of your mind a little placeholder. What if everything that you consider okay today may be considered completely wrong tomorrow. That happens to people who spend all their day thinking about right and wrong. So if you think about the Pope, maybe the Pope is too liberal, maybe he's too conservative, maybe he's too Catholic, maybe he's too this, maybe he's too little of that, whatever your feelings are. The thing that is very clear is this is a man who spends almost all of his day thinking about right and wrong. And so when he thought about right and wrong as a cardinal in June 2010, his feeling about gay marriage is it was a destructive attempt towards God's plan. And 3 years later, as Pope Francis, he came out and said, you know, if someone's gay and searching for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? And think about that for 1 second. Here is a person who really thinks about theology and right and wrong shifting 180 degrees in 3 years. And as you're thinking about that, it wasn't just the Pope who shifted, it was the entire US population. So in 1997, 2/3 of the US population was brought up to believe that gay marriage was wrong, that you shouldn't allow gay marriage. Fast forward 2017, 2/3 have now shifted, not only to say that gay marriage is acceptable and legal, but taking the position which is 180 degrees for the majority, opposed to what was in 1997, where people were saying this is wrong, this is evil, this is illegal, to now saying anybody who supports the 1997 position should be boycotted, they should be exiled, they should be branded as bigots, they should be branded as people who shouldn't be allowed to have a store or a place in civilized society. And boy, that's a whiplash for people in a very short period of time on what many consider a fundamental right or moral issue. And by the way, last month, the Pope shifted directly into support for same-sex civil unions against much of his church. This is a transition that you see happening again and again. And it's a transition that technology will drive very different attitudes. It will drive you into very different places. So in the same way as the technology of all of a sudden having Twitter and having Facebook and having very specific channels for media polarized society in a way which it had rarely been polarized before, it drove people into trenches in a way which they'd very rarely been before. Technology also upends sex. So imagine for a second talking about sex with your great-grandparents or your grandparents, and you bring them back in a time machine, and they're 21 years old, and you're going to talk about sex. Well, at 21, they were probably married. They probably knew about sex. But let's try explaining the pill to them. So, Grandpa, Grandma, do you now realize that we can now have sex consistently and not have a child? And yes, there had been previous methods of birth control, but they were often failures. So what you've now done is you've systemically separated the act from the consequences. Then you try explaining IVF to them. And you say, okay, so IVF means that two people, two bodies never have to touch each other. They don't have to be in the same room. They don't have to be in the same city. And they can conceive a child together. And of course, they look at you and they say, well, look, that used to be the Immaculate Conception, and that was a miracle. And then you go and you talk to them about freezing eggs, freezing sperm, having surrogate mothers for pay. And that would creep them out, because not only is a different mother carrying your child to term, not only is it being done for pay, but there's also this notion that if you can freeze an egg and freeze a sperm, then you can have a baby in not 9 months, but 9 years, or 20 years, or 30 years. And so you've decoupled sex from time. So just think about these three technologies and what people considered right and wrong in your grandparents' time and today. And so you've decoupled sex from consequence. You've decoupled sex from physical contact and you decouple sex from time. Had your grandparents been asked, are any of these things right? They would have said, hell no. And today, of course, you talk about should you do this or not with your friend over a latte. Think about this in the context of going forward. So now your 70-year-old grandchildren bring you back in the time machine and they talk to you about sex. Do you think it's going to look anything like what it looks like today? You get some hints of this when you look at the patent for the first artificial uterus. And that's 1955, and not much happened until a few years ago. And a few years ago, what ended up happening is all of a sudden, you were able to bring lambs to term outside the body in a giant Ziploc bag. And you look at this, and it's a very squeamish picture. This is not a pretty picture. If that was a human embryo, I think it would elicit howls of disgust and calls for banning. But a technology like this can fundamentally upend entire debates about what's right and what's wrong, because it would enable mothers to give birth to children and not carry them. And you might see a discussion in a generation or two where a child is outraged that her mother took her mountain biking while she was in her body, or took her to X country and got sick on the food while she was in her body, or exposed the child to smoke from wildfires instead of staying inside a nice safe bag in a hospital. There's a second implication of this, which is it completely changes the debate on abortion. There is a third aspect to this, which is once the baby, the fetus, is outside the body, it becomes much easier to intervene, to do operations, to edit. And again, these are all things which I think almost all of us on this call would say, yuck, that doesn't sound right. But remember, this stuff can flip 180 degrees. So what is now a CRISPR baby scandal, because babies are being edited, could be a very different structure once you begin to safely, faster, better, cheaper edit babies. And you could see a situation where, again, your grandchildren age 70 are having a conversation and say, you know, my mom and my dad were so primitive and so backward that they didn't bother to edit my genes. So I kept the BRCA1 gene, I kept the P53, I kept the KRAS, and I'm dying of cancer or suffering cancer because my primitive, superstitious parents didn't edit me. Maybe I should have sued them for not editing me. How does our notion of right and wrong evolve? Well, the traditional view, and partially correct, is that there's a very complex debate between religion and morals and philosophy, and then you get laws built out of this. And yeah, that's true. But the thing people often ignore is how often technology impacts ethics and changes ethics in fundamental ways. And so what you get across a whole series of places is technologies displacing old religions. And all of a sudden, one religion becomes more dominant. Take, for instance, the rise of Islam. So Islam just spread like wildfire across the world in a period of very few decades. And partly that was due to they had good generals, they had good weapons, Byzantium was falling apart, it was disorganized, there was infighting. Yeah, all that's true. But there's a factor in the rise of Islam which is also very important, which is this took place after the Justinian plague. And the Justinian plague makes today's plague look like a joke. I mean, this is something that was killing large percentages of the population wherever it came across. And imagine two flocks of faithful praying that God protects them from the plague. So here's one flock that call themselves Christians, and they don't like to bathe. In fact, they only bathe on their saint's day and a couple of times a year. They just part of their custom. And here is a new religion that says, before you pray, and you must pray 5 times a day, you must wash your feet, you must wash your hands, and you must wash your face. Well, guess for 1 minute which God is going to protect a larger percentage of the flock? The one that practices no sanitary practices during a plague, or the one that practices a great deal of sanitation during a plague? And so you get this rise in believers because on average, this becomes a more effective way of warding off the plague, of having God protect you. You can take some of the most horrendous of human acts, which is to enslave somebody, to put somebody into indentured servitude, to make somebody a serf, to take their freedom. And I think all of us would agree this is absolutely immoral, wrong, illegal, should not exist. If we all agree on that, then the interesting question is, why did this occur not just in the US South, but why did this occur across all cultures for hundreds of thousands of years? So why did the Incas and the Mayas and the Chinese and the Greeks and the Indian and the Swedes and everybody else treat people in this way and take their freedom? If we know it is so fundamentally wrong, why was it accepted? And why did it take us so long to stop it? Now, there are various explanations for this. One explanation, which is, I think, absolutely true, is there were a series of people who were incredibly brave who spoke up. So people like Harriet Tubman, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, the various abolitionists, they took a position which was way ahead of its time. They were often attacked for taking that position. They put their lives in danger, and sometimes they were killed. But that occurred many times across many societies. And the quote-unquote legality of enslaving others went away in a short period of decades in most of the world. Why? So one explanation for this is we couldn't find a way of making stuff without treating other people in an absolutely horrible way. So if you were a king, if you were a emperor, if you were X or Y or Z, you would go and conquer lands, and you would take those people and make them, force them to work for you. And the result was the world economy did not grow for thousands of years. This is a way of making a king rich, but it is not a way of improving overall economic output. So when did this change? It began to change when you started using energy and machines. So I don't think it's a complete coincidence that some of the first places where slavery was abolished was England, where you had the Industrial Revolution, and New England, where you began to have these mills and you began to have machinery. And so what's going on here? Well, one of the things that happened is you started using energy. And every barrel of oil contains 10 years of a person's labor. So every time you burn a barrel of oil, you're basically using up 10 years of a human's labor. And when you add that to thousands of horsepower, then what's happening is you're concentrating enormous power in small machines. And let's put that in very specific terms. A jet engine like this one basically is putting out every hour the work of 160,000 people. So when you remember those old Viking ships where you'd have some big guy up at the front and he'd be banging on the drum, and there'd be all these people manacled to oars, and they'd have to pull on the oars to move the ship? Well, when you fly across country, when you go from New York to San Francisco, in essence, what these two jet engines are doing is they're putting the energy of 320,000 people to row you across country. Except you don't need 320,000 people to do that. You need these two engines. So here's what happened to life expectancy. Here's what technology did. Technology helped eliminate slavery. Technology helped eliminate indentured servitude. In a legal sense, I understand there is still slavery in the world. I understand there's still indentured servitude, but it is not legal in any place. And it is not expected, and it is not right. So for the most part, it's gone away. And that was a great thing, because after thousands and thousands of years, life expectancy, which had been a steady 20 to 30 years, suddenly explodes. And it explodes across all continents. Here's what happened to the world economy. A world economy which had been stagnant for millennia all of a sudden explodes, first with the Industrial Revolution and then the Digital Revolution. So what you're doing is you're allowing people to maintain their lifestyle. You're providing something which is an energy alternative that is faster, better, cheaper, and far more just and ethical and right. And you're making a global economy which just becomes enormously larger. So technology, I think, in this instance, allowed us to begin to do what we should have done thousands and thousands of years ago. It's an interesting question if you begin to consider technology a primary driver of ethics. Because if you think of it in those terms, what's happening today is technology is exponential. Technology changes ethics. And that means that ethics may begin to change at exponential rates. And this whipsaw of this is accepted for a long time, and then suddenly it flips 180 degrees and it becomes absolutely wrong, may happen to us at a faster and faster rate. Take Impossible Burgers. Again, there are a whole series of enlightened activists who are vegans, who are adamant that we should not be keeping animals, slaughtering animals, but the majority is not there yet. The majority does not think this is the wrong behavior yet. The first synthetic meat cost $230,000 a hamburger in 2013. The next one cost $30 in 2015. This package was about $9 at Whole Foods last week. And so when you begin to think of this and these cost curves, and what it does is as synthetic meat becomes faster, better, cheaper, you don't have to consume live animals. You don't have to slaughter 6 billion animals a year. And the majority is going to shift on whether this is okay or not. And pictures like this one are going to become absolutely barbaric. Do you know that my grandpa used to take grandma to the fanciest, most expensive restaurants in our city? And they would walk in past hanging carcasses that were rotting, that they called aged meats. I mean, can you imagine how barbaric they were? So I think you're going to see a really radical shift on something like this. You will probably also see a similar shift on energy. As the price of solar, as the price of wind crosses coal and then crosses oil in terms of cost output per hour, those people who burned coal and those people who burned oil will be crucified, including most of us. So because technology changes ethics, I think one of the things we need to do is we need to bring back a couple of words that have been banished in today's polarized discourse. These are words you don't hear a lot these days. When you're judging the founding fathers, when you're judging people who were anti this or pro that, and that is humility and forgiveness. You don't hear a lot of people saying we should forgive X for having used the wrong pronoun, or for having triggered X, or for having insulted me in Y, or for having held this position 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But I think it's really important when you're judging people, when you're taking the position, I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm right and they were all wrong, that you consider a little humility and forgiveness, because if you don't judge your ancestors with a little more kindness and hope your descendants will do the same, then you may be doing everything right today, but the rules may shift. The meaning of a word may shift. The context of what you did may shift. Something that you didn't realize you were doing may become very apparent in the future was wrong, or people in the future may have an alternative that you didn't have and judge you in the context of having that alternative when you didn't have it. This is not justifying what happened in the past. This is not saying what happened in the past was right. This is in no way saying, hey, those people who hurt other people were doing the right thing. But it's putting a slight bit of context on what was going on then, what was a 14 or 15-year-old taught back then, versus what is a 14 or 15-year-old taught today. If even you don't always know right from wrong, humility and forgiveness is especially important during an era where we are all electronically tattooed to an extreme. Because what's happening today is people will be able to go back in a year, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and know your life to an extent that we never knew the life of any king, any artist, any famous person. Because the most ordinary of people have now been electronically tattooed by Google, by Facebook, by Twitter, by Instagram, by their credit cards, by their dating profile, by their tolls, by their phones. We're going to know more about each of our lives than we've ever known about the most famous people in history. And so we will be judged. And we better hope that folks in the future are slightly gentler in their judgment than sometimes we are being on other people today. And that's why right wrong isn't a right wrong. Right wrong is something that changes, and that's what makes ethics so interesting and challenging and difficult, and why we need to discuss this stuff much more. Thank you.
Juan, thank you very, very much. I will tell you that since I've read the book, big chunks of it have echoed in my head and caused me concern, not the least of which is watching the media refer back to statements that current politicians have made 15 or 20 years ago without this perspective. So here's what we're going to do next. We're going to do some Q&A. Basically, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then Kate will promote you and you can turn your video on or off. That's your choice. But I thought I would start with a question just to give everybody a chance to participate. And then we've got some questions from the Media Lab team as well. So let's begin with kind of a big one. Can ethics ever keep up with technology, or does the nature of ethics always end up running behind and trying to rethink things after we've let the genie out of the bottle?
You know, I think it's incredibly important to have an iterative conversation, because on the one hand, technology will allow you to do things you never dreamed you'd be able to do. So it's hard to anticipate. But on the other hand, you have to think, okay, where are we today and where do we want to get to? And we may not be able to get there quite yet, or we may not have the resources to do it. But I think we have to start rethinking some of our systems, like capitalism, in fundamentally different parameters.
Just go a little further there. When you say rethink, we're rethinking as a community, we're rethinking in education, we're rethinking at universities, or are we talking about government? Like, where does the rethinking begin?
So let's just pull the string on capitalism a little bit. If you say we need to rethink capitalism today, you're either in a trench which is free markets or socialism, and you're kind of forced into one of those two buckets. And that's completely wrong, because the parameters have changed. For the longest time, economics was the allocation of scarcity. So how are we going to administer scarce resources? How are we going to allocate them? And what's happened over the last few decades is we have more than enough of almost anything. We have more than enough calories to feed everybody in the world. We have more than enough antibiotics. We have more than enough antiseptics. We have more than enough bed nets. We have enough energy to give everybody a basic standard of living and a basic education. And that is global, right? We have the money to do that. In a sense, what that does is it changes the debate from the justification of I didn't do it because there wasn't enough to there was more than enough, why didn't you do it? And ethically, that is a very different battleground. It becomes a distribution issue as opposed to an availability issue. And we have to start thinking of economics in a different term and how we judge people in different terms.
So a couple of people have put questions into the chat. So I'll ask one on behalf of Eric Zimmerman. So Eric asks, on an individual level, how do you think about a North Star that influences your ethics throughout your life and even as things change versus the adoption of new information influencing opinions all the time?
You know, I think one of the things that is incredibly important in this is to listen a lot and to try and understand why would somebody hold an opinion that's so different from mine? Because if you enter a discussion with this person is wrong, and let me think of all the ways of opposing this person's vision. First, you're not going to be very effective at arguing, and second, you're not going to learn a lot from this person. So I think you've got to begin discussions from the concept of 98 or 99% of the people in this world are decent people who want a better life, who want a better life for their kids, who love their mothers, and want to treat each other in a better way. And as you're thinking of it in those terms, then it becomes a lot easier to do two things. You have to isolate the 1 or 2% that are violent sociopaths and the people who are truly evil and the people who systematically steal children from their parents and make them orphans. That is stuff that the Argentine junta did, that the Brazilian generals did, that the Chilean torturers did. And that's also something the United States did. And that will be seen historically far worse than the Japanese internment. Because in the Japanese internment, you kept those families together. And here you deliberately separate them. So be a little bit more cautious when you're talking to people who you consider the others. And don't lump them all together with the 1 or 2% who are truly evil. Because then you're giving a cover to the 1 or 2%. And they're saying, well, we're just a huge group that thinks this way. No, you're not. Right? Leave those people in the trenches and take other people towards the middle ground. But you do that by listening and understanding. Somebody with a conservative Catholic education may have a position that you think is completely wrong vis-a-vis what you were brought up with. Try and understand why that person had that position and how people like the Pope change their positions.
So here's a question from one of our attendees listed as anonymous. During the Industrial Revolution, Britain and the American North still relied on slavery for resources, e.g. cotton. Even if industrialists didn't employ enslaved people, what does it mean to do right if your ability to do so is contingent upon allowing others to continue to do wrong?
That is an incredibly important question. It is an absolutely accurate statement. And it's a question we should be asking ourselves. In what universe is it right for us to walk by somebody who is lying on a park bench and freezing because they're homeless? And we do that. Under what circumstances is it right for us to allow the cost of education to keep increasing and increasing and increasing to the point where many can't do that, or the price of medicines? in what universe is it okay for us to continue to burn fossil fuels knowing what it's doing to the planet? So the answer for those folks is also important for us, because we're doing a lot of stuff that instinctively we know is wrong, and we're tolerating a lot of stuff that instinctively we know is wrong. And it goes back to that wonderful tweet. If you think you would have been an abolitionist during the period of slavery, if you think you would have been marching in Selma during the era of civil rights, show me what you're doing today.
Something a little more granular, big tech. There is this drumbeat about breaking up big tech. Because a lot of what you're talking about is rational, even-tempered, thoughtful conversations among people that disagree, but we are living in a moment where that's very hard to do. Is the profit motive of the current social platforms going to drive us to these extremes unless government steps in?
You know, I think that's an absolutely central question for the Media Lab, because I think that is the question of our times. And I think unless if you are advocating violence, or unless if you're advocating civil insurrection, or something that is truly harmful, like disinformation about a pandemic, I would be very wary of allowing government to have the ability to say, you can say this or not say that. So imagine for a second that Donald Trump had control over what the networks could say or couldn't say, or what Facebook or Twitter could say or not say. And I say this full well understanding how misused those media have been. But I think erring on the side of more liberty is less dangerous to a society than erring on the side of more restrictions.
So I want to invite my colleague, Erica Matsumoto, to ask a question. She wrote some earlier. So Erica, jump in.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Steve. And hi, Juan. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts today. So from the team, we have some questions. So let's see. You mentioned you cite some really great examples around how technology can really shape and inform and shift our perspective on right and wrong. There were some really fascinating examples. We wanted to ask you, what's your perspective on technologies like brain-computer interfaces? We know that that's also coming up with things like Control Lab and Neuralink. So yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So part of what drove me to write, it takes me about 6 years to write a book. And I never start with a thesis. I never start with an outline. I just start getting curious about a subject. And what ends up happening is I'll write 2,000 or 3,000 pages, and then it'll suddenly come to me that I really need to bring this down into a thesis in 200 pages or 250 pages. And so it isn't, I'm trying to prove a point or I know where I'm going. It's what the hell's going on here? And that's sort of a consistent method to my madness. So how did this book on ethics come about, and why did it come about? It started from the position of people asking me, because of my work on genomics and altering genes and working on brain interfaces and synthetic neurobiology, how do you know what's right and what's wrong? And I started out with, okay, I should write a short something, an essay on right and wrong in genomics and gene editing and brain interfaces. And boy, did that get complicated, right? That led me down a rabbit hole while I was writing a book on the brain of trying to understand right and wrong in ethics, and finding right and wrong is really it's like a continent that moves. So as you think about AI and as you think about brain interfaces, The first thing you've got to think about is what we think is right today may be completely wrong tomorrow and vice versa. The second thing you want to think about is what is the core of our humanity and what is it that we want to preserve and what is it that you'd want to augment and what is it that you'd want to modify in a fundamental way. And you can get really complicated really fast. So I'll give you one example. If you take one of the most gruesome experiments you can take and cut off a mouse head and transplant that mouse head onto another mouse in the way in which you do a heart or a kidney, the core question you want to answer is, does the new mouse still love Minnie Mouse? Does the new mouse still feel the same way about what it likes, what it hates, what it's afraid of? Because if the answer is yes, then it means that you can transplant a brain onto another body. And you can transplant memories. And then the question, which gets really weird, is the only other interface a body? Because you've already proven you can download this. Does it have to be downloaded into a body? And then the questions get even weirder. If you could model a brain and model the electrical or chemical activity of a brain and download it, could you download it into a non-DNA based life form, which would be powered by the brain? And why in the hell would you ever dream of doing that? Because if you could download memories and consciousness into a silicon chip, it means that you can travel interstellar space without having to feed 2,000 or 3,000 calories into a body and protect it from radiation. So one of the very few ways that I can see that make interstellar travel potential for our brains and consciousness is to think about structures that are very different. Because otherwise, even at the speed of light, you're going to be having things which are inconceivable lifespans simply to get to the neighboring galaxy. So it gets very deep, very weird, very fast.
Fascinating. Yeah, that actually reminds me, my undergrad major was philosophy, so I'm reminded of the Descartes floating brain theory of in metaphysics. But yeah, that gets real weird real fast.
Juan, is there something just around the, like you have access to scientific work that we're not privy to? Are there things likely to happen really soon that will be mind-blowing, or is it all going to be kind of slow motion evolution?
No, we're focusing an enormous amount of energy, again, justifiably, on political processes and on the pandemic and everything else. I'm not saying don't focus on that. I am saying that while countries rise and fall, and while pandemics come and go, and while tyrants come and go, technology is moving ever faster. And so while you're focused on this problem over here, technology is just going like light speed over here. Now, it may not happen in the same country, especially if you don't have H-1B visas and genius visas, especially if you shut down your universities, especially if you don't respect science. You can take down a country very quickly, but that's not going to stop technology. It's just going to happen somewhere else. And so as you're thinking about this stuff, for me, every day is like Christmas, because you get your new science magazine, or you get your new Nature magazine, or you get your new MIT technology review, or you read articles about X, Y, or Z in Neuron or something else. And every one of those things every day, not every one of those things, every day brings you something that is ever more mind-blowing, right? The stuff we're finding in the last month, that there may be 300 million or some ungodly number of habitable planets in the Milky Way alone, right? I mean, that it just completely changes your perspective on where you're going to find life. The fact that you're finding certain chemicals in meteorites and you may have found life on Venus. That means life is probably common throughout the universe, right? And that changes your perspective. So this stuff is moving at light speed. Our position in the universe is moving at light speed. The instruments we have are moving at light speed. And that's part of what makes the discussion of ethics so urgent, because as we learn so much more, as we become so much more powerful, as power decentralizes, it becomes essential we leave less people behind and angry. The destructive power that people have increases exponentially from a rock to a sword to a machine gun to a bomb to a nuclear bomb to X, Y, or Z. And the notion that we're just going to build a wall and be safe, yeah, right. Good luck. It's just really important that we not leave people behind. It's really important we create a greater humanity.
So I have to ask about this book, which is a long time ago now. And I remember a conversation that you and I had. It's got to be, is it 10? When was it published? 12 years ago? 15?
2005.
I haven't reread it, although I did page through it because I knew we were going to spend time together. And it occurred to me to ask kind of a basic question. As you rethink the thesis of the book and all of the exploration of changing natures of countries, do you think you got anything wrong?
Oh, I always get a lot of stuff wrong.
I mean, it seems like we're exactly where that book told us we were going to be. I mean, you laid out demographics with absolute clarity and said, here's where it's going, folks.
Well, the argument in that book, which was the Untied States of America, polarization, fracturing in our future, is we're going to have a giant financial crisis. It's going to be because of over leverage in real estate. We're going to get through that, but the long-term consequences is it's going to split and polarize politics globally. So you're going to have a whole bunch of countries falling apart and fighting against one another. It was meant as a warning. It wasn't meant as a how-to manual. And unfortunately, you know, a book which I wrote, which seems so outlandish, that a Secretary of Defense came after me at the Aspen Institute and a Supreme Court Justice came after me and said, how dare you write this? How dare you ask how many stars will be in the US flag in 50 years? Why are you doing this? Both have since come back and said, we wish we'd read it more carefully. And this notion of how many stars will be in the US flag, it seems absolutely insane until you realize there has never been a president of the United States buried under the same number of stars he was born under. Right? This country is not that old. And no president has been born under the same number of stars that he was born under. And until somebody dies after 1959, without a change in that flag, there won't be a president buried under the same number of flags. Jimmy Carter was not born under 50 stars, right? It's just, so it sounds like a crazy question. It's not.
We almost bought Greenland.
We almost bought Greenland.
Well, actually not.
I actually would have happily exchanged Greenland for Florida, maybe.
Puerto Rican statehood?
I'm sorry?
Puerto Rican statehood?
Well, you could easily see Puerto Rico become a state. You could easily see the District of Columbia become a state. You could see Texas split. You could see California split. I mean, look, people assume what happens in other places will never happen to you. But if we continue spending billions and billions of dollars each electoral cycle, convincing 50.1% of the country that the other 49.9% are nothing like you, you should never talk to them. These guys over here are pedophiles. These guys over here are QAnon. These people over here are baby killers. These people over here are nuts. You know, if you actually convince half of the population that is true, then you get into a situation like Spain's getting into, where the Basques want to leave, the Catalans want to leave, the Galicians want to leave, or in France where the Corsicans want to leave, or in northern Italy that wants to leave southern Italy, or in southern Finland, or Belgium with the Walloons. it is very easy to split a country. And what's at stake in how we treat each other and listen to one another is whether you have an Untitled States of America or a United States of America. And this is not a joke, right? These games that we're playing with delegitimizing elections and democracy and parties has real long-term consequences. And you will destroy a nation if we keep treating each other like this. If you actually begin to believe that every single Republican or every single Democrat is X, Y, or Z, and that you should never talk to them, you'll get some of the effects that you're seeing throughout the rest of the world. And that would be a tragedy.
Juan, thank you so much. I will just say one last thing. If you find Juan on Facebook and follow him, you will find that he's alternately political, future thinking, and incredibly funny. I don't know how you do it. You find things that I don't know where they come from, but they're hysterically funny. So if you're looking for either insight or a laugh, his Facebook is a great place to follow. Thank you for taking the time. Very much
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great fun.